Welcome back to the IU427 garage, everybody. We are working on Jim's Mk4 today. We're going to be diving in behind the dash. We're going to pull the steering wheel. We are going to try to get the fuel level sensor attached to the dash, or reattached to the dash in the proper way. That is to use the wires that go back to the gas tank rather than running it kind of hokey the way they did before. And we're going to try to adjust the steering position in the car. So hang with us. I'm going to show you what I've got going over there. I do have the steering wheel out of the car, and I pulled out my knock puller because the steering shaft in there is seized. It has grown some rust. So the inner shaft is kind of rusted to the outer shaft. And if you've seen the double D shaft that Factory 5 uses, it's a shaft inside a shaft, and that creates the crumple zone. So if you're ever involved in an accident and you're pushed forward into the steering wheel, the steering wheel will move forward because it's held in place by some set screws and some Belleville washers. So it gives some flexibility so that if it needs to be pushed forward in an accident, it will. In our case, the shaft is so far out that it's nearly in your chest as you sit in the car, which is not a comfortable position. I don't know how the NASCAR guys do that, with the steering wheel like right against their chest. But anyways, so what we've got is we've got the steering wheel out and we've got the steering shaft projecting out. Now, if you'll notice, there's a lot of surface rust on this. And I'm going to show you why we didn't show any signs of surface rust before. So basically, this piece of tubing and these two globs of black tape were around the steering shaft. So this was over the steering shaft like this, and down in this position here, and then the steering wheel was on there. And that tape that you see globbed all over on the back of the F350 workbench was wrapped around here to build up the thickness so that this would fit inside the end of the steering wheel. And it's just, I could just see this thing binding up at some point in this car's future and the steering wheel not being able to turn because that was pushed right up against the bearing that holds the steering shaft. So if something were to get, lodged in there, or if it was to wear funny and create some type of crack, and you can see on this one end, it almost looks like someone cut this with their teeth. I mean, look at how jagged that cut is. So what we're going to do is, I took this apart all last night, and I should have, before I went in, I should have sprayed some penetrating lube in between the two shafts to hopefully loosen it up. But I ran out of time, and it was well past feeding time for both me and the dogs, and so I ran inside to feed the dogs, and I never made it back out to the shop last night. So tonight, before I go in, I want to make sure that I lube all that stuff down and try to work it in, basically putting the steering wheel back on there. And even with the Belleville washers in where they're supposed to be, you can get a little bit of movement between those two shafts, and hopefully I can get some of that penetrating lube to go down. But knowing that shaft is probably rusted inside the other shaft as well, it's going to be tough. And so what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to lubricate it a couple nights in a row, and then I'm going to go after it with the knock puller. So I'm going to basically make myself like a bracket, like an offset bracket here that I bolt to here with the 3/8 bolt that Factory 5 supplies for the steering wheel. And then I'm going to have a hole over here to put the knock puller through, along with the nut that my knock puller comes with, and hopefully get enough force to get this thing to pop loose. And then what I'll have to do is I'll have to take that steering shaft, and I'm going to have to take some emery cloth or sandpaper, and I'm going to have to get all that rust off of there. And then I'm going to have to treat it. And I'm going to treat it with either like a WD-40 or one of those products that's going to prevent it from rusting again. And then I'll lube it up with some axle grease. I'll set my Belleville washers back in there, and then I'll run it in. And the axle grease is going to keep it from rusting later on down the line, and it's going to make it to where if we ever have to pull that thing out again, we'll be able to get it out. Now, I'm not going to slather it in axle grease. I'm just going to put a thin coating all over the portions of it that are going to slide inside so that we can get it in or out later if it ever has to come out again. And don't forget, there's 2 set screws on there too. So the set screws were put on the back side of the carrier bearing. I usually put them on the front so they're easier to get to. I'm going to swap that around so that I can get that and make it more easily accessible later if it ever has to come out again. So it's a lot to take in. I'm out of breath. I'm going to catch up with you guys tomorrow where hopefully, fingers crossed, we can pull that steering shaft out. All right, I figured I'd bring you guys back. I've been working for about another hour out here, and I started to get some of the dash opened up. Here, I'm gonna give everybody this tip again because it bears repeating. If you follow the instructions for Factory 5 as far as the dash installation, you're never going to be able to get the dash off. Okay? Because there's a screw behind the body right here, and there's a screw behind the body over on the other side of the car in about the same spot. Now you could push up right here a little bit to get that screw out, but most likely you're going to get that. You're gonna mess up the body right here. You can get that one out. Can't get the middle one out. You can get the next one out. Same thing down there for that 4th or what is that? 5th one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So when you're attaching the dash, use some common sense and realize that if you don't make some brackets that drop the locations that you're putting your screws in to hold your dash in place lower, you're never going to get the dash out. So the only way to get this dash out of the car would be to either pull the windshield, the doors, the trunk deck lid, the hood, and then pull the body off, or strip the vinyl covering off the face of the dash and cut the heads of the screws with like a Sawzall. And I did that on one car. Way back when, if you go back on our Facebook page, we had a yellow car here, a Mark II, and we needed to get behind the dash because we needed to add Phytech fuel injection to the car. And so I needed access to all the wires behind the dash for the fuses and everything else. And so we ended up doing that and recovering the dash, and then we put brackets on to lower those mounting points on with a brand new dash panel. By the time we got the old dash panel out, I had to make a new dash panel. So it always bears repeating, make sure you have access to those screws after the body's put on. Don't think about this as just getting the car done, thinking you're never going to get behind the dash. Knowing the frequency at which these gauges seem to have problems, make it easy on yourself and make the dash more easily removable. So the second thing that I ran into, and this has only been like 45 minutes or an hour, guys, I started going through some of the wiring that's here behind the dash. And what I found, as a for instance, I found the circuits for, these are marked EFI and coil, right? So this is for fuel injection if you want it, which is fine. I mean, yeah, he did an adequate job of safing these off. He put butt connectors on the end, so the chances are they're never going to come in contact with anything and you know, light up and and cause issues. But then we found this switch that's mounted to the structure behind the dash. So I started looking at the wires that go into the back of it, and it's 2 blue wires. Well, those are the wires to the clutch safety switch. Now, I haven't climbed in to see if there is a clutch safety switch in here, but I think someone used this as like a security measure to, to make sure that the car could not be started if that switch was in the off position, which, isn't a bad idea, but Jim didn't know it was here. And so if, someone was fiddling behind the dash and that switch got turned off, the car would never start. The other thing that we found, and you can just see evidence of it, is, I'm trying to hold the flashlight and the camera with one hand here. These two wires here are for the inertia switch. Now, this car has a mechanical fuel pump, so it doesn't go through the inertia switch. But wouldn't it be nice to have that switch if anybody at some point wanted to add electronic fuel injection to this car? Well, guess where that switch, the actual switch itself, is mounted? It's mounted to the back side of this 2-inch square tube. You can't get to it. So I've got to now drop the dash down. Let's see if I can put this over here. I've got to now drop, not the dash, I've got to drop the fuse box here down so I can get to the screws that are up and in behind that 2-inch cross member and get that thing out of there and move it to the front side of the dash bar. And these are things I wasn't expecting, but I guess, expect the unexpected. I've also got the tachometer pulled out. I've just got it pulled out so I can have better access in behind the dash. And I've got the wing on the end of the dash pulled out, if you saw. So if you are careful, and I stress that, you have to be careful because you don't want to rub off the paint on the, this edge here. You can pull this out and get access in to this area. I think what we're going to do is we're going to trim this back about here so there's less of it to go back in, which will make it easier later if I need to get in there again. But so we're working on getting some of the wiring straightened out. There's a lot of wiring underneath the dash that I just don't know where it goes. We've got ground wires that are just tied to other ground wires, and I have no idea, like this one here, I've got no idea where they ground. So I'm going to try to trace some of those out and make sure that if they aren't grounded, that they are not in use, and then we'll have to tuck them somewhere where they're not going to be, so later it doesn't confuse, any of the wiring that we're trying to diagnose on the car later. So I'm going to keep at it. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to soak that steering shaft down one more time before I go in for the evening. But I just wanted this to be documented, and I'm going to be past this point tomorrow, and so this was the best time to do it. Again, the inertia switch, we don't need it right at this moment, but I know Jim has talked with me about possibly getting rid of the stacks if they become a service issue, and it sure would be nice to be able to utilize the wiring that's already in the car to wire in an EFI system rather than having to, scratch build something from start to finish. We've already got the harness in, all the components are already here. Let's make them accessible so that if we decide later that we're going to do that, we can tie onto that stuff and get it installed in a relatively short amount of time with the least amount of money. Yeah, so there you go. I'll see you guys tomorrow. All right, everybody, back in the shop. It's been a couple days. I have been working out here every night, but due to my frustration level, I have not been picking up the camera. My frustration level isn't any lower right now, but I needed to make an update because I want everybody to know and have them follow along on what they're in for if they buy a used Factory 5 and run into some of these issues. So if you remember, our steering shaft was too far out of the dash in the chest of the driver. And I knew that it was not going to push in, meaning the inner shaft was not going to push into the outer shaft because I could see all the surface rust on the outside of the inner shaft that was exposed. So my first attempt was to use a knock puller. And if you don't know what a knock puller is, it is a slide hammer. Knock puller is just the word that I remember growing up. So this is what it looks like. It's this device here. There are threads on the end of it, and you basically either use like a 3-jaw puller or something like that around whatever you're attempting to pull out, and then you pull it out. Now you can see I even booger up some of the threads on there. I'm gonna have to clean those up. But there was really no way to attach it to the steering wheel, so I made myself a jig, fixture, whatever you want to call it. Basically, I took some square tubing, I drilled a 3/8 hole in the end of it. This bolt in the end, I can't even get out right now because it the size of the hole has been reduced from all of the beating that it's taken. You can see it's all mushroomed out. At one point I had to go back and re-weld some of the welds around the outside. This was a piece that had a cap on it previously, and I thought the welds on it would hold, and they didn't, and so I had to go back and weld them again. And then I welded this piece on the top, drilled a hole that corresponded to the size hole I needed for the end of the knock puller, so this slides on there, and then I have a nut that threads on there. And then sliding the weight against the end, which is belled out, usually produces enough force to knock, that's the name knock puller, whatever it is off. And all it did was to distort the end of this. And this is, you know, this is what, 1/8 inch? So that's 120 wall, and it just tore it up. So I gave up on that idea because I could just see it wasn't going to work. So my next option was to pull the entire steering shaft out of the car. And having it in all one piece, I knew it was going to be difficult. I just didn't know how difficult. I may have had an easier time with the Mustang pedals in here versus the Wilwood pedals. But again, you can't get the pedals out with the body on the car. There's no access. I mean, I guess I could have, but in the long run, I kept talking myself out of it, and I figured there's got to be a way to get this out. And every time I ran into an obstacle, I'd get a little farther, and then I ran into another obstacle. Like one of the first obstacles I ran into was that I needed someone to hold an Allen wrench on the engine side of the button head screws that hold the bearing, the bearing flange in, and there was nobody here. My helper is out on another job today, and she's home now, but I had nobody to hold the wrench while I tried to spin off the nut on the inside of the footbox. And I called a neighbor, and of course the neighbor didn't answer his phone. So I found a way. I got it out far enough that I was able to get a vice grip set of pliers on there, and then I spun it slowly enough so that the vice grip caught something, and then I kept tension on it, and I got both nuts off. And then once I got that bearing that's on the inside bearing flange kept getting caught on everything. So first it got caught on the brake pedal, and then I figured out that I could by depressing the brake pedal, I could wiggle it around that, and so I did that. That was the next hurdle. And then I got the bearing all the way to the firewall, which is right here, right about there, and there was no way to get it past there. I just couldn't get an angle on it. So I didn't want to pull any more stuff out of the car. I mean, I've got so much stuff that I've done, and at a certain point you just get tired of working backwards. But the last thing that was in the way was this piece right here. If you remember, this is our fuel line and our fuel filter that I just installed in the car last week. And I had no choice. That was the only way to get that whole thing out in one piece. Now, I disassembled that steering shaft at different points during the removal, And the first thing was I had to get the shaft adapter out. Now this is a splined adapter. This is for the older Mark IVs and the Mark IIIs. I had to get all the set screws loose on this, which I had just put in and tightened and put Loctite on. So I had that. So that goes with this lock nut, or that's set screw and this set screw, I think. Was that it? No. It's one of these. Anyways, this one, and this one, and then this one with the nut on it. So these two go in here, and they lock it to the shaft, and then this one goes in here, and it locks it to the spline on the other. And then this is the rest of the shaft, and you can see this is where the shaft adapter goes in, and there's set screw dimples on each side of that go into that adapter that we had. So I finally got it out. So that was the hard part, you'd think. Turns out that was hard, but getting the shafts apart was harder. The knock puller was my first indication that these things were just rusted together. And no amount of spraying penetrating oil from the outside was working. So I knew, since I had been soaking it down every night before I went in for the evening, I knew that trying to spray it down from the outside just wasn't going to do any good. So what I ended up doing is on the end of this shaft, I'll pull this out of the vise real quick. It's probably going to drop on the floor. On the end of this universal joint, what I did is I drilled a hole. I don't know if you can see that. You should. Yeah, right there. First I drilled it with a 16th or an 1/8 inch bit, and then I drilled it out to 3/16. And I had it standing straight up here, kind of like that, in the vise. And then I used this down that hole with the shaft still in the bottom. And I just went in the house for a snack. And I figured, well, I'm just going to let this thing sit. If I have to, I'll let it sit overnight. But by the time I got back in here, I had 2 soaked paper towels. I had put paper towels underneath the bottom of the shaft before I went inside. I had 2 soaked paper towels, so I figured, well, I know that penetrating lube has made its way through, and now it's dripping out the bottom, and sure enough, it had been. And so at that point, what I did was I gave it a couple of taps, a couple little love taps against the concrete floor. I grabbed the steering shaft and I knocked it on the ground, and it moved. It didn't move a lot, but it moved. And I thought, well, if I got it to move that much, just knocking it down on the concrete, I should be able to stick it in the vise. And then what I did is I grabbed a punch. And the hammer. And what I started doing is I started tapping. This piece is upside down right now, but I started tapping that outer shaft off of this inner shaft down this way. Now keep in mind, at that point I had this bearing on here and it was stuck at the top here. So I was able to tap, and I finally got it loose. Now this, as rusted as this is right here, it had just as much rust, if not more, all the way down all 4 sides of this shaft. And that's why it had seized itself in there. Here's the 2 Belleville washers. They were rusty too, and they're stainless. So the rust had built up so much in these recesses in the shaft that it had rusted over onto those Belleville washers as well. So I mean, that thing was in there. So I'm going to stress to anybody who watches this video, when you're assembling this steering shaft, and I don't care if it's the older one that we're using from the earlier Mark IV or Mark III, or the later Mark IV that Factory 5 is supplying now, which is, I think it's stainless. But regardless, smear a little grease on there before you put it together. It'll keep it from rusting. And that lubrication will allow that thing to be pulled out later. It's held in place with set screws. So it's not like you need it in there super tight in order to keep the slop out of the steering wheel, because that's what the Belleville washers are for. So lubricate that thing up and do yourself a favor. We do this on every build that we do, that we build from the start. We lubricate that inner shaft, and so when it goes together, we have at least a chance of getting that thing apart later on. That wasn't done here. So I'm going to start cleaning all this stuff up. As you can see, I've already cleaned the shaft up, but I want to clean the bearings off. So I want to take the bearings, I want to clean them up with some brake clean, get all the residue off of both of these, and then I'll re-lubricate those, and then I want to start putting this thing back together. Now, all of this was just so that we could adjust the steering wheel. But there was just no other way. I mean, I could have rapped on that thing with a hammer, and I may have gotten it to go in, but no one would ever be able to get it out. So here is everything all cleaned up. I still need to put the lower shaft and the intermediate shaft together at the U-joint. I'll do that here real soon. The screws for those are right there. Basically, those are just set screws that hold the edges of the U-joints in. You can see one right there on that U-joint. And I've got all the bearings and the bearing retainers cleaned up. I did grab some new nylock nuts for all of our button head screws. I haven't cleaned up the rack adapter yet, but I'm going to get on that next. And then this stuff will start going in. So hopefully tomorrow I'll have this put all back together and I can concentrate on some of the stuff behind the dash, because I really want to get that stuff done. So that really the only thing I have left on Jim's car is going to be putting the seats back in, fixing the carpet, and then any last straggling little things that I've missed so far. So, oh well, here we go. Alright, I am beat up. This steering shaft in Jim's car has just killed me. But it's all in place. It's all, except for the steering wheel. I haven't tightened the steering wheel down yet. Everything's in place. Everything's installed the way it's supposed to be now. And we lubed the inner steering shaft as it went into the intermediate shaft when we installed the Belleville washers. The grease on that also helps to keep the Belleville washers in place too. So that's a good little tip. If you're having a hard time as you're putting it together with the Belleville washers falling out, one, always do it so the shaft is facing up and the Belleville washers sit on top. But if you put some grease on there, axle grease, to lubricate that inner shaft, as you put it in, the grease will hold those Belleville washers in place. So if you do just move the steering wheel or the shaft a little bit, they don't fall off. But so those are in. Like I said, the only thing left is to tighten down the center bolt for the steering wheel. But I'm going to wait on that. All the set screws are tight on all of the pillow block bearings and the firewall bearing in the front of the car. And I haven't even gotten to the stuff behind the dash yet. So I know that the video may not reflect how much time I've spent on this, but my back sure knows exactly how much time all this has taken. So all of the front steering shaft is put together. All of the set screws on that are thread locked, so they're not going to come off. We did add a stop nut to the main set screw, so that's got a stop nut now. And we lubricated all of these U-joints. So I went ahead and I pressed out the bearing caps on each side of those and added some grease and then put them all back together, because I figured this thing's probably going to be on here for a good long time before anybody gives it attention again. So, you know, if you're installing one of these from new, you know, if you just got your kit and you're just installing it for the first time, they're pre-greased. So you don't really need to worry too much about lubricating those U-joints, because they should be lubricated when you get them. But if you're pulling it apart, it sure makes sense to check to make sure there's still grease in there, that they haven't become saturated in dirt and dust, and the grease is, you know, suspect because of all the dirt and everything that's in them. So if you've got it out and you know, you have the time, take them apart, clean them, re-lubricate them, put them back together, and then make sure you use some thread locker on all of those stop nuts that go on the outside to keep the bearing caps in. Other than that, I think I'm going to carry over the rest of the stuff behind the dash into the next video because, like I said, I'm beat. I need a break. It's Sunday afternoon. I think it's about 3 o'clock or so. Yeah, it's about 3 o'clock. I'm done for the day. I've had enough, and I'm going to go in. I'm going to grab a cool one, and I'm going to take the rest of the afternoon off. So we'll see you guys all next time. Appreciate all of you watching. If you like the content, please do the like, the share, the subscribe, all that good stuff. We'll see you next time. Have a great day.